Hi, I'm David Lurie. You might remember me from such videos as Do the Steps or Die. No, I'm just kidding. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about depression, what it looks like, some of the definitions of it, some of the symptoms, and of course some of the treatment options, and a whole bunch more about depression. So one of the things about depression that I'll mention right off the bat is that I have been diagnosed with severe depressive disorder. Okay, so I am medicated now. I have not always been medicated for it. I did not get medicated for it until I came into recovery, and even then it took 10 years because I fought the diagnosis, I fought the feelings, I fought what was happening to me. What made it impossible for me to fight it anymore was chronic pain. So chronic pain basically pushed me over the edge of depression, of maybe situational depression, into severe depression. Something happened. I'm not a doctor, okay, so I'm not claiming to understand that fully, but there are some biological implications that contribute and that are part of correlation, maybe even a part of the causation of depression, that start with the body, okay? So we're going to talk about the physical depression first and what goes on just a little bit. Now, at the end of this video, we're going to attach a link so that you can find Robert Sapolsky's lecture on depression, because I'm going to recommend you do that. I'm going to talk about some of the things he talks about because they hit the nail right on the head, right? So if you watch this video and then you go watch his video, you're probably going to be very similar, right? He'll have more in-depth information on the medical side of things, as well as the psychological, right? In terms of terminology, what parts of the brain are affected, which neurons are firing and which neurons aren't catching, etc. All those different things that go into the medical side of this. But we can talk about the physical, like the meaning of it in terms of biology. It's defined as a biochemical disorder, okay? So it is a biochemical disorder, and that means there's chemicals that are not necessarily doing what they're supposed to be doing, okay? There's neurons that aren't receiving messages that they're supposed to receive. There's all kinds of stuff going on in the brain, okay? So I listened to Robert Sapolsky describe this in terms of, try to think of depression like, I'm going to try to get the quote, but go listen to the video. It was something about, in terms of, depression is when your frontal cortex is constantly whispering to your limbic system and your reptilian brain, which is your brain stem and etc. Okay? It's constantly whispering to those parts of your brain that you're sad. Okay? So what the cortex does, the cortex is our ration, it's our reason. Okay? It helps us mediate all these different things that our brain thinks. And it sends impulses and messages to the limbic system, to your, amygdala, all that stuff that goes on in the lizard brain, right? It sends those messages, but it's almost like your cortex is so trusted that the rest of your brain believes it when it says we're really sad, okay? Now, the trouble is that if there's a chemical imbalance going on inside the brain, obviously that chemical imbalance is going all through the brain, okay? It's getting passed all the way through. So there are lots of options in terms of treatment. Not all of them are good, okay? Not all of them are going to seem good. But we have to remember that what's happening in the brain with some of the severe cases, and again, I don't know the difference between what severe and mild depression in terms of ongoing melancholia, right? So anyway, I don't know all the ways it is. So if you have questions about that, look into that. But really, depression, for me, the physical symptoms that define my depression setting in kind of thing, I don't know how else to describe it. I see depression, right, in my life. So when I see that, what happens to me is, at first, there's like a wet towel that goes over the frontal cortex in my brain, okay? And again, I don't know what it's like for other people. Some similarities in terms of like heavy brain. I've heard other men and women who have depression or live with depression. It's hard to describe it because you don't want to give it ownership, right, over your life, but it has to be spoken about honestly, right? That's all depression. First, there's like a wet towel that it feels like it gets drenched across the front of my brain, and it weighs a lot, right? So it's basically the physical, I'm describing the physical sensation that happens when the depression first starts to try to set in, okay? And that is it feels like a wet brain. Like my brain is a sponge and it's full of water. And there's nothing going on there that's positive. And so, of course, when Dr. Sapolsky was talking about the cortex whispering, it makes a lot of sense to me because that's kind of where it starts, right? It starts in the cortex, or at least that's where I think it starts, where I can tangibly note that something has begun, besides the kind of intangibles of my thinking went down a different path, right? Which we're going to get to, because that happens too. Once the frontal cortex in my brain starts to feel saturated with water and heavy, then the rest of my brain starts to try to survive, right? So it goes instantly back into the old habits that I would do, right? So I can't drink anymore, I can't use morphine anymore. So my brain looks for something to make it feel better, to get it out of that state, even though time and experience has shown me that there's nothing I can do except for continue to take my medication, do my meditations, do my breathing, do my exercises, go outside, talk to somebody. Those are things I have to do. I don't have much of a choice anymore, because now when I can sense that the depression is present and the depression is setting in, what I start to feel is I start to feel panicky, like I'm supposed to change this, right? Because I've been taught that if you're depressed, you're weak. Obviously, you're not able to deal with stuff. You're not able to cope with things. But of course, I was told those things by people that didn't understand the biochemistry of it, right? which, in all fairness to them, some of this stuff is like as literally as recent as like within the last 10 years. Okay, some of the science, 10, 15 years, whatever it is. So the reality of 15 years is not a long time. Okay, so that basically is enough time for us to realize, okay, shit, we didn't know exactly what this was doing, okay, to a human. But now we can realize this. So if you're out there and you're struggling in silence or suffering in silence with depression because of the stigma of it, I'm hoping this video helps you, right? Because I felt that stigma too. I felt it for a long time, most of my life, trying to hide it, right? Whether it was trying to hide my depression, which just made me feel worse, or trying to hide my sexuality, which just made me feel worse, and of course contributed to the depression becoming severe, right? Now, this goes back to, there are some genetics involved in depression, from what the science says, okay? Now, I'm going to totally butcher this, so please, I encourage you to investigate. So, the genetics of it. So, there is some genetics involved, but also the genes don't necessarily get activated the same in everyone. So, this gene that they were talking about, and I cannot remember the name of it, so please look it up, but there's a specific gene, apparently, directly related to depression, okay? So, if you get the good gene, the good version of this gene, apparently the depression is possible, but it's more likely to build up over the course of time with lots of stress happening, okay, within that course of time. So you can develop it with the good gene, it's just not necessarily as quick, I guess. That's really the interpretation I got of the information. Please look it up. But if you get the bad gene, then you're more likely to develop severe depressive disorders. Like, that's basically what it said. Does that mean the gene alone does it? No. If you have the bad gene and it's activated by severe stress, usually they say in childhood or adolescence, but of course, if we don't get it diagnosed prior, we will absolutely potentially make it worse. Okay, the longer we put it off. That's what I've done. That's what I did. I made mine worse by not, I did what I had to do and I don't regret it, but I am going to acknowledge the fact that had I not been so slow to get into the treatment of the depression, I may have been able to circumvent some things, right? Hindsight's 20/20, who gives a shit about it anyway? Because you can't go backwards, right? The reality is that now I just simply had to accept the fact that this was going on inside my brain, okay? There was no more ability for me to write it off and justify, and because once I hurt my back and I was waiting to get surgery, the pain was so awful. Through that year, I saw myself resort to, I still smoked back then, so I was almost smoking 2 packs a day. I was being promiscuous with people I had no business and no need to be promiscuous with. And then, of course, the result of that was that year of getting closer to my first surgery, my back surgery, but also I was, like, by the time I got to the surgery, I was so defeated by everything, like everything. Somehow I was able to quit smoking. The day before my first surgery was the last day I smoked. Somehow I quit smoking, even though I was fully, like, super full on just depressed. Like, I could not get out of it. My back was in so much pain. Every bit of relief we went for caused more pain. So we're also going to talk a little bit about chronic pain here as well, because depression and chronic pain kind of go hand in hand, right? Or at least in my experience with some of the people that I work with who are also living with chronic pain, it seems to go hand in hand. Because over time, and Dr. Sapolsky talks about it in his lecture, but over time, there's a difference between melancholia and mourning, okay? So the difference between mourning and melancholia. So I know this seems like I just did a big diversion, but actually it'll describe it way differently and probably more succinctly, okay? So you have melancholia, which is the disorder, okay? If we just look at it, that's the old word that I think it's Freudian. It was melancholia. And so this is the only time that we really give any credit to Freud. But he came up with the melancholia because that describes the severe depression that lasts over time, and it doesn't clear up when we're finished mourning, right? So if you can kind of put that into circumstances like, when do we get depressed? We lose a job, okay? But most people, when they lose a job, maybe we get depressed for a week or two or maybe 3, however long, but eventually come out of it, right? And you don't need medicine to come out of it. You just come out of it through the natural process of grieving someone or something that we've lost, okay? But when you can't come out of it, okay, when you need other things to come out of that, then it starts to take on a biochemical meaning, right? So if I needed medication, which I did, to come out of it, that was the only thing that was going to help me, was medication. Because there was a part of talk therapy talk therapy couldn't touch the biochemical part, okay? Talk therapy helped me with the psychology of the depression, absolutely. Talking about it, investigating it, realizing that the symptoms that I experience are 100% normal for humans with depression, okay? So some of the symptoms are, sometimes if I go to bed late, I'm working, I wake up early, it'll happen even though I'm tired, okay? And listening to Dr. Sapolsky describe this was like, he was talking to me, right, through this video, because that's exactly what I go through. I could go to bed at 2 in the morning and wake up at 6 or 5 when the depression has me. That's my life. I don't eat much, right? And I thought that, there's lots of people that say, oh, like when I'm depressed, I eat. And I realized that is a component, potentially, of the downside of, or the symptom of a depression is to overeat. And I know some people do that. My habit, though, when it hits, is to not eat. Like, I shut down eating, right? And the hinge pin for that is stress, right? Stress, if I get too stressed, but I'm not depressed, I might binge eat, right? Which I'm very aware of as time goes on. And I constantly am trying to recorrect and adjust. But so if I'm stressed but not depressed, I tend to have like an eating binge. Like I'll eat a whole pizza. I know, it's ridiculous, but it happens. But if I'm stressed plus depressed, I don't eat. I don't eat at all. I don't even think about it. The reality is that I live with my partner now, and if it wasn't for her asking if I'd eaten when the depression comes in, I wouldn't eat. It's not because I'm trying not to eat, it's just because my brain doesn't tell me I need to eat, okay? That really took shape and form in the first year that I was laid up and trying to get myself through until surgery. That really reared its ugly head that I wouldn't eat, because I would go days. I would go days with it, right? And some of it was the nerve blockers they had me on because I didn't know I was hungry half the time, but the rest of it was, in analysis, post-analysis, I remember that a lot of it was because I was so depressed. There was a period where, I'll give you a little bit of history about me. I used to work out like a banshee. Before I hurt my back, I was in the gym 5-6 days a week. And so I was constantly training. I thought I was doing safely. The last year of the training, I was really doing better. I got with a trainer. I was working really hard on form and all this stuff. But then my back gave out, and then we determined that there was all kinds of back issues. So I had to go from a guy who worked out 5-6 days a week, and I'm not talking about 30-minute workouts, I mean a couple hours of work each day that I went. And so was it excessive? Probably, because my body gave out. Okay, so I recognized that that was not the optimal of my health. However, it was a big part of me staying level, right? About my moods, my depression. It was one way that I knew from the time I was a teenager to handle my feelings was to work out, because that's what I learned. Thankfully, I learned that because I know how hard it is to get back in the groove of working out, especially if you've never had it. But just to try to put a point on that first year where my depression really took hold of me again. Probably the first time in sobriety where I really thought, not the first time, because there were times prior where I thought about suicide. But this changed it from suicidal thoughts to ideations to planning, right? So out there in the world, you know that once you start planning, that's when things start to get a little bit more dangerous, right? The idea now, this isn't the same for everybody, but for me, I'll just tell you the truth. Every day, whether it's a good day, a bad day, or indifferent, every day I think of taking my life, at least once. Now, when the depression has me, the thoughts become way more persistent, way more alluring, okay? And you might be laughing, like, what's alluring about it? Well, letting go is alluring, right? When all you feel is pain, letting go and dying is painless, right? And the truth of the matter is, it is. Once you're gone, that pain's over. Now, there's a saying that you just transfer that pain to other people, and that might be true, that some of that pain transfers because people love us and all that kind of stuff. But that's not why you do it. It's not why I attempted suicide. It wasn't to hurt anybody. It was to stop the fucking pain. It was to stop the cycle in my head, the battle in my head, right? So anyway, that first year of being kind of laid up, half working, half laid up, or no, I was still working. I was still working full-time hours. I don't know what I'm thinking. But laid up whenever I wasn't working. I could barely walk around the block some days. I was in so much pain. So that accumulated over the course of a year, right? And of course, the depression, I wasn't addressing it. Okay, well, to address it, let me rephrase that. I was self-medicating my depression with cigarettes, sugar, okay? Cigarettes, sugar, sex, all of the things which will eventually need me to correct if I want to get better, right? Because obviously, look, I've lived most of my life promiscuously, most of it, 40 years out of 45, 46, right? 40 years out of 46 years, because even when I was a young child, unfortunately, I was brought into being promiscuous. So since I was a young child, that's been my life, okay? So that first year when I was laid up, that was my go-to, man. It was my go-to to not take my life. And then when the doctor said, okay, well, we got to give you these meds, these pain meds, I didn't want to take opiates, but I had no choice at the time, or I thought I had no choice at the time. So I went ahead, I did what they told me. I was working with my sponsor during this time, talking to him. And the reality is that none of it made it better, it made it worse. It compounded the depression. And that's like going to be another discussion probably on a different video, but it's to talk about opiates and what they do. I'll tell you briefly what they did to me. Okay, what they did to me was they put me in a place where all I want to do is end it. That's it. I know that lots of people get help from them, but after sobering up and after having used opiates, not in their prescribed manner, it just didn't have the same effect on me anymore. All it did was make me feel awful. So I knew I had to stop that, so I tried to I transitioned away from the opiates and I used nerve blockers instead of Percocets, and it didn't take away the pain, I'll tell you that right now, but it did absolutely sometimes allow me to disassociate from it, because nerve blockers disconnect you from your nerves, right? Like your brain's like, oh, like everything's fine. You ate yesterday, you're fine. You're not hungry, the nerves in your stomach aren't telling you to eat, right? They're not telling your brain you need food because they're blocked. Now, we wish that would just block the pain area, but that's not how it works. So, and in my case, because I went away from opiates, I was taking the maximum dosage of a specific nerve blocker to try to mediate the pain, right? And of course, it didn't work. It didn't work over time. So anyway, that first year, the depression was really persistent, okay? And I'll get into some of the more of the symptoms. We talked about the wet brain. We talked about it with a little bit of a wet towel on the front of my brain, and then it sends those signals to the back, to the lizard brain, to the, I don't know, all different parts, the limbic system, the other systems, and it basically kept me there. So after my first surgery, I thought I went to hell when I was coming out of anesthesia. My first surgery was about 10 and a half hours long, I think, that I was out. And when I came out of that, it felt like I was coming out of hell, and that life had changed again, right? That all of a sudden I recognized suicide was an answer, and it was a fine one, right? And I know some people might be thinking, how did your brain go there? Well, that's just where my brain went. Could be a part of the depression, could be simply a part of the habits that I built up over the course of my life. But anyway, I came out of that surgery and I felt fucked, like full on fucked. The pain wasn't gone after the time they said it was going to get better. It just gradually got worse again. And then it got worse again to the point where it crippled me at my house. And I had to get help to go to the doctor and to get another surgery done quicker than as opposed to later, because what had happened was apparently the cage that was around my spine had started to pinch my spinal cord or column. I can't quite remember now. But anyway, it was awful. It was awful, horrendous. The worst pain I've been in since the back stuff happened. And they got me back in the operating room within 2 weeks of my first surgery because it was so bad. And after that surgery, I came out of there feeling a little bit more optimistic, but the optimism was overshadowed pretty quickly by the symptoms of the depression, the habits that I had gotten into in terms of coping with the depression. See, all of those things are temporary, right? And we know this, we've talked about it with the steps, with other things, but the feeling of relief is temporary, right? Whether it be drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, it's temporary, but it's immediate, right? It gives us the immediate sensation that we're better, okay? So at this point, I just want to make a point of saying, just because you feel better doesn't mean you are better, okay? And it doesn't mean you have to be better all of a sudden. Feeling better is temporary. This is one of the things that I've learned with the way my illness, depression kind of attacks me or comes to me, or however you want to describe it. The reality is, that's what it does, okay? It tries to push me off of the path that I'm on and get me more focused on the pain as opposed to the recovery, right? Because we can do that, and I did that. After the first surgery, all I could focus on was pain. I wasn't focused on getting better, but something was dramatically wrong inside my back. So I knew that, because I could tell because of the pain. And so as it got worse and worse and worse, obviously you can't get out of that by thinking your way out of that, because the pain is there. That's not to say that meditation can't help with managing pain, because it does. But the reality is that depression, when it sets in, it's beyond my control. Okay, I can do all of the things that I've been taught to do, and eventually it goes away, right? But the things that I've been taught to do, one of the things is call for help, which I do. When I I had a depressive episode over the holidays, and that was the closest I've been to suicide, to taking my own life, probably in 5 or 6 years, maybe 10. It could have even been 10 years. It was that dramatic and that close, to the point where I called the distress center. I made some other calls. I then went back to what had been working for me, which is meditation, which is slowing down and breathing, which is doing those things. And we talked about it with cognitive behavioral therapy, reframing things, right? I had to start reframing things or else I was gone, right? But the key to that was reaching out and talking about it, okay? Just because I felt, and I do feel this way even as I'm telling you, I feel like I should not have been there again, that I was doing way better than that, right? But that's the thing about a biochemical disorder, he doesn't fucking care. Okay, it doesn't care. It doesn't, there's very little that I could do to control it. But those little things that I can do, I want to try to do, right? So sleeping, diet, talking about it with someone who understands, someone who can maybe help, someone can reflect back to you, whatever it is, finding someone that we trust to talk to, whether it be a counselor or otherwise. I don't think it has to be specific, unless you might be at a point where the only thing that's going to help you is medication. If that's the case, please go to a doctor. Okay? If you're suffering and you're not getting a break from the symptoms of depression, please see a physician. Okay? Because it's fine that we get to talk about and do an overview so that we can try to stay ahead of it, right? Because one of the keys to recovery is being proactive, right? Recovery from anything. Okay? So first, we'll go back. So we've got lots of symptoms. Now sometimes people will say, main symptom, I don't want to get out of bed. Everything is awful. I have no ability to see the light. And that's true for me too, because I'm pretty much an optimistic human until that depression gets a hold of me. But so the symptoms, all kinds of symptoms. You might not eat, you might eat too much, but mostly, from what I understand, it's lack of eating for depression. Anxiety might bring another one, but for me, I'll tie in a little bit of anxiety. Anxiety is the same thing. Anxiety and depression mixed with stress means I'm not going to eat. Okay, I'm too anxious. So what happens, one of the symptoms that happens to me is when I start feeling that wet towel on my head, what happens is I start reverting back to when I was a child. Somewhere in my head, I start reverting back, trying to get away from the feeling, okay, that I have no control over. And I can appreciate it. It's why I self-medicated most of my life with one thing or another, right? It's because I wasn't treating the actual thing that was happening. I was treating the symptoms and not the illness, right? Which is the same thing we talk about with alcoholism and drug addiction. We can treat all the symptoms, okay? But those are symptoms. That's not treating the problem, okay? So we're getting into a place now where we're going to look at, we're treating symptoms because we have to. We have no choice. If you don't treat the symptoms might get you, right? But you got to make sure that we're focused on the overall what is going on, right? If I have a clinical depression, I want to understand that, okay? So I want to go and I want to learn about it, but I also want to go to a doctor and walk with a doctor during this time. So just as an example, by being open with my doctor, I was able to have a phone call with him during the pandemic, and we were able to isolate some things that maybe we need to change in terms of my practice of treatment. But none of them were major, and we had an easy conversation about it, right? Look, I like my doctor. My doctor's a good man. I don't know who your doctor is. But if your doctor's not willing to have a conversation with you about your mental health in an open way, then you might need a new doctor. Because this is a reality, right? This doctor happened to kind of save my life, really, because when I finally agreed to get on medication was when I walked into his office, Paul, and said, I don't know if I'm going to make it if you let me leave here. And so that was two people who had to be vulnerable, right? I had to be vulnerable and trust that he was going to try to help me without locking me up. However, I also recognized that he might have to lock me up. That would have been okay too. I made my peace with it. By okay, I just mean I made my peace with it. I would not have liked it at all. I would have regretted it. And I probably would have been bitter for a bit until I realized that person may have saved my life. Because of the level of desperation that I showed in that office, he showed a level of restraint that I really appreciate and that I hope I give to others. So anyway, the symptoms. For me, it's the daily talk in my head of suicide turns into not a talk, it turns into a lecture. Okay? It turns into, when the depression hits, that self-talk turns into self-gospel, right? It turns into gospel. Look at all the shit you did, you need to fucking leave here. People are going to find out, okay? People are going to find out you're a piece of shit. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know anything about what you're talking about, which may be true. But the reality is, that voice becomes more persistent when that brain feels heavy and wet, right? And so you put my hand on it right now, I could feel it too, right? Because I was talking to Darcy about this before the video. It's just really interesting timing that we plan to do a depression video And yesterday my depression decided to say hi and decided to like try to push me into a pit. Now, some of you might be like, well, why the fuck would you do this then? And that's a fair question. The reason is because I want to acknowledge that this is happening and move through it. Okay, I don't want to be stuck in it. When I get stuck there, then I am in more danger, right? So part of the reason why my depression was even acting up yesterday might have been because I'm planning this video. I'm learning, studying stuff, trying to understand more about how depression is generally as opposed to just for me, right? And yeah, so the understanding has expanded, but of course with that means you're gonna have to do some work outside of me because I'm not a fucking doctor, okay? And if you want a doctor's opinion, go see a doctor, okay? We're trying to learn how to live with this in recovery. Now I know there's a lot of people in recovery who struggle with depression, what we call depression. Now I believe what most of us experience in that respect is the mourning period, the mourning process of learning a new life, letting go of an old life, which can, for lots of us, can mean friends, family, jobs, money. It can mean all kinds of things that we have to let go of, right? That's a good reason to be fucking depressed, right? Even if you don't have depression. So what we want to learn though is that over time is what we want to look at. We don't need to look at like, okay, now my friend passed away. Like when my friends have died and through the years of being sober, that was mourning. I was mourning them, right? But sometimes in the mourning, that would definitely trigger my depression, okay? Now, I have the severe depressive disorder. I haven't. I want it, yay. This is a part of my life, but you might not. So I've got some stats, pretty simple stats, but if you're out there wondering if depression is real, you don't have to wonder anymore, okay? It's real. It's a biochemical disorder, it's a psychological disorder, and it's recognized by the World Health Organization as, right now, it's the number 4 cause of disability on the planet, not in a country, on the planet. They're expecting by 2025, it'll be number 2. The number 2 reason why people are just go on to disability will be depression, okay? So this is a very real thing. It is not made up in your mind, okay? Now, this isn't about you can't pull up your bootstraps here and put on a fucking happy face, okay? That advice is bullshit. It's not bullshit if you know your friend doesn't have depression. Okay? If you know your friend isn't gonna wallow and potentially hurt themselves because you tell them they should just get over it, right? So again, I'm not gonna tell you how to talk to people, but I am 100% gonna tell you that if that's how you talk to people, you're not helping, okay? If you're not gonna listen to what the person is going through, what they think it is. Now, it doesn't matter whether what they think is true, okay? What matters is that they think it's true. That in order for them, for me, for us to get these things unraveled, if maybe we're just depressed and we don't have a depression, right? That is a different story. You've got mourning versus melancholia. Melancholia is a disposition, okay? Mourning is more situational. But now, obviously from the genetic work that they've done, you can develop it over time. If you're exposed to lots of stress, that's beyond your control. Because psychologically, depression is defined by learned helplessness. Okay? So how do you learn to be helpless? It's when you're constantly faced with things, okay, that you have no control over. Which is one of the reasons why I think they look at early childhood development and then later childhood, adolescent development as catalytic times to develop these kinds of difficulties, okay? These kind of disorders. But depression is just as real as diabetes, okay? We need to beat it out of our heads that it's not real, that it's made up, okay? It's number 4 reason for people to go on disability from the World Health Organization, okay? It's not a government body that's trying to sell you something. It's a body saying, this is where we're at, okay? Number 2, within 5 years. Okay, I would be shocked if it's not number 1 within the end of 2020s, right? I wouldn't be shocked at all. We have ignored it. We have minimized it for people. We have painted people into corners with our dogma about it. And on top of that, the internet's not helping, okay, in terms of memes. And people saying, well, I don't get depressed, I just go do this. You're not dealing with depression if that's all you need to do, okay? So think about it out there, all the big mouths, right, who know about everybody else's issues but their own. I am one of them, right? Is what we got to think about is, okay, this is hard for me. This is probably hard for others, okay? Or this is easy for me. If it's easy for me, maybe I don't have this thing in my brain, okay? That might be true. Thank God you don't have it, okay? If you don't have depression or anxiety disorder or schizophrenia or any of the number of mental illnesses that a person can have. And when I say a person, I mean any person. It includes you. You can get it too, right? We all are vulnerable because we're human. So in order to allow other people to be vulnerable and heal in the way they need to heal, those of us who might not be vulnerable to this thing, we could probably stand to be like supportive, right? Because we may not have depression, but we may have something else that we don't want to talk about, right? And so I get that. Nobody wants to talk about depression because it's fucking depressing, right? Like Darcy asked me when we took a little break, he said, are you okay? And I'm like, I think so. But it is depressing, right? And so the reality is there's lots of symptoms, just like there's people, there's lots of symptoms to depression. Whatever kind of puts you in that place, right? Or keeps you in that place, that dark place, right? Whatever it means. There are some treatment options. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the treatment options. You're probably well aware of them. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history of the treatment options, and I'm going to give it a brief job because you're going to go back and you're going to listen to Dr. Sapolsky's lecture, and you're going to get all the nuts and bolts that I have no idea about. The history. So antidepressants. Okay, back in the day, they thought it was, I'm going to need my paper for this. They learned that there was a neuropinephrine, a lack of neuropinephrine in people with depression. Okay, so what they did was they studied medications that would allow for the connection, I believe, of the neuropinephrine hormones. Hormones? Chemical? Look it up, because I'm obviously fucking you up here. Okay, but that's how they started. They noticed that the neuropinephrines, they were excited about it, but then they realized that, oh my God, like, this isn't solving all the problems for depression. Because there's more to it than that. We all want one answer. I want one answer. I want to be able to go to my doctor and say, how do I deal with this depression? And have him say, this is the answer. But you know why he can't? It's because they don't know what the answer is. Okay? And this is evidence. The only reason I'm pointing this out is because you don't know is not really that big of a deal. Me not knowing is not that big of a deal. The fucking doctors don't know. Okay? So we have to be patient with this process. Because the doctors, just like us, we're becoming more and more educated about these illnesses with the advancements of science, and that will bring, obviously, within the next 10 to 15 years, another jump in the technology and the understanding. So please allow this information room to grow, okay? So there's another thing. They learned about dopamine, okay? They learned what they thought was it was more vital than norepinephrine, okay, in dealing with depression. The reality is it's equally as vital. There's, depending on what the biochemical imbalance is, depends on what chemicals we need replenished, right? So then the last one, another one is serotonin. Okay, now we've learned through SSRIs that serotonin is a big part of being positive, to have serotonin, right? Positive effect, positive emotions, emotive. So now we have SSRIs instead of the old antidepressants, which I can't even pronounce the name of them. So I won't try. But the reality is that there's lots of medications that they've determined help depression. Okay? Now, choosing medication is hard because doctors don't know, not yet anyway, not until we're able to I know of some places across the planet now, they can 3D print the proper medication for people, specific people. They can do that, right? Obviously it's expensive right now, so we're not doing it everywhere because it's probably a pretty costly enterprise. I don't know how much it costs. You could look that up too. But I've heard the stories that they have done it. They've actually been able to narrow down which medication will work best for certain people and their illness. And of course, all the other things going on outside of the depression, genetics, everything, right? So that kind of treatment is gradually moving forward, okay? There's obviously also talk therapy treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, 12 steps, meditation, behavior modification. There's all kinds of stuff that we need to do, okay? So that's why I'm not just giving you one option, because all of the options to me are imperative. Now, in terms of the 7 Habits of Healthy People, or whatever the fuck that book was called, there was a offshoot that a doctor down in the States did about 7 habits for recovery. I'm not going to get into all of them, but I am going to talk about the one that I learned today, or learned about today, not learned, I don't know it all, obviously. But the one I learned about today was be proactive, okay? And what that means, this is what we're trying to do. In between stretches of that depression, when it hits me, what I'm trying to do is I want to build the in-between time, right? With things that are going to help me when that comes. Now, obviously that might sound like I'm just living to get through another depression. Sometimes that's as simple as it is. I'm just living to get through it, right? Because some days are good with it. Some days I handle it, when it comes, I handle it with grace. Other days I fucking don't. And I needed to learn how to be human there, right? But what I also learned was that in-between time is so important, right? In between the episodes or the depressive symptoms, whatever you want to call it, is so vital what I do, right? So vital how I treat myself. Because like last week, for example, we were joking about this off camera. I was on basically 3 days alone in the mountains. I was meditating tons, walking tons, doing all these wonderfully spiritual things. And then the middle of the week happens to be a Wednesday, and my brain went wonky, just wonky. The difference today is that because I've increased my in-between time, meditation, breathing, studies, I've increased, now I went from literally in the morning meditating for a half an hour to some mornings I do an hour and a half. Depends on what I have to do, depends on what the day's looking like, and how I'm feeling. But what I realized, that in-between time is vital, right? So am I likely to do an hour meditation when my depression hits? No, I'm not. But if I can build up some hour meditations before, I might learn something in that time that will help me with the next depression that it comes. So it's that in-between time, because I know that when it hits, I'm going to struggle. I'm going to struggle to do the things I need to do. I'm going to struggle to meditate. I'm going to have to force myself to sit there for a half an hour, despite the fact that I don't fucking want to, right? But I could only learn that by doing it. Because then what I learn by the time I get to that depressive symptom or episode is I've learned that it'll pass. I've learned that even though I'm sitting, meditating, and my brain is still going like squirrels in those wheels, the hamster wheels, right? But I can still sit there with it and let the world spin, right? Because what's taught to me in meditation is stillness. That no matter what happens in the head, I can still be still and quiet. Because what happens in the head is not necessarily me. That's the function of the brain, right? So understanding that, getting that separation is what meditation helps me with. Separating me from those thoughts. Reminding me that those thoughts in my head are just thoughts in my head. Reminding me that cognition is 100% based on the information we already have. Every cognition I make, every cognitive move I make or thought I take is based 100% on my experience. Okay? Whether I remember it or not, because cognition cannot be based on a future knowledge. It can't be, because it's based present, right? Now, will I be able to learn new cognition over the next year? Absolutely I will, right? But I'm going to have to practice that to stay on those pathways, okay? Of allowing myself to let go of the past and be here, okay? Anyway, I got off on a tangent. So, treatment options, talk therapy, understanding what we're going through obviously is imperative. Peer support, okay? There are people in my life that struggle with exactly what I go through. And having them in my life is no accident. And them having me in their life is no accident, right? We are adults choosing to be around people who understand, but also encourage, right? Understanding's fine, but I have friends that understand and tell me the fucking truth when I'm full of shit. They go, whoa, what's that about? And then I have to reevaluate. We need people like that in our life, okay? As much as it might seem it's just like negative, but that's where the internet fucks us up again. It says things like, if people are negative, get them out of your life. If people don't agree with you, aren't on your mission, get them out of your life. What that sounds like is a person who is so afraid they need to have control over everything. And that means only keeping people close who are going to agree with you. And I did that for a good chunk of my sobriety because I wasn't willing to do the rest of it. So I isolated myself. Part of my depression, for sure, part of my history, my historic depression, is isolating and pushing people away. So for a big chunk of time, in the middle of my sobriety, right, so I've been sober for almost 16 years in August. So somewhere in the middle of that 16 years, okay, there was a period where I didn't fucking invite anything into my life. There was nothing getting in. Don't get me wrong, I still had relationships with women and men and whatever else, but I sure as fuck wasn't having a real relationship. And I gotta be honest about that, because I was shut in, okay? I didn't even have visitors to my apartment unless I was having sex with them. Those were the only people who came to my apartment, right? Not my friends. Like, it just wasn't an inviting place to be, right? Because I was locked up in there, hiding from the difficulties of my depression, of the world, of my life, all the different things that I could think of, right? Okay, so treatment options, keep your options open, right? Because here's the downside. Here's the extreme end of depression. The extreme end, and these treatments are still available. The extreme end are lobotomies, okay? There's a frontal lobotomy, and then there's another thing called let me see if I can pronounce this word. Where is it? That's the wrong page. I won't even try to pronounce the word. But what they do is they snip the connection between the cortex and the limbic system and your reptile brain. So when they snip that, of course you don't feel depressed anymore because the cortex isn't communicating with sadness anymore. So now the back of the brain is all concerned with life, death, mating kind of thing. Basically, you're left to your own devices. It's like basically cutting off the part of your brain that makes you human and not just a mammal and a lizard. So it works though, right? It works. However, it works in taking both away your pleasure and your pain, right? Because there's no recognition now. There's no connection to the cortex. There's no making rational, reasonable sense about stuff because it's not connected, right? So those are the extreme ends of treatment for depression. They still do it, okay? Now it's voluntary, but they still do electroshock therapy as well, okay? I was working with a friend, with a person who was opting for the electroshock therapy. The reason they didn't go through with it was because they just happened to find a balance of medication, right, that allowed this person to function and even start to thrive a little bit. And so it was wonderful that they didn't go all the way through with the lobotomy that they were signed up for. Or sorry, not the lobotomy, the shock therapy. Because shock therapy then goes to the frontal lobotomy, which is, from my understanding, it's more of a, oh, I think you go here kind of thing, right? And they just take a chunk out of your cortex or something like that. But the snipping, whatever it's called, something lobotomy, and it's not the same. But that snipping is like obviously irreversible, like, and so is the lobotomy, right? We'll be stuck with, and so is the electroshock therapy to some extent. Like that, obviously, some of the damage done by that treatment is going to be awful, right? Does it work? Sometimes it does. That's the trick. That's why these things are still around, right? They weren't completely off base when they did the frontal lobotomies. They were basically approaching it from a perspective of, oh, this was an accident, how we found this out, right? It was someone who lost a chunk of their frontal cortex way, way back before they even had an idea what the cortex was, and that person turned from a mild-mannered human into a psycho, right? So, because it was the part of the frontal cortex that got knocked out with this accident he was in, and it turned him into a psycho. He was devout Christian beforehand, and by devout Christian, I'm not trying to say they're all good, because we know that's not true, but he was I guess, by all accounts, he was like a good Christian man. And then, because it was so long ago, everybody was judged by being Christian or not. He turned into a wife beater. I believe he ended up killing somebody. I could be totally wrong on that. But again, go back to Dr. Sapolsky's lectures. You'll find out all about that as well. That's not in the depression lecture. That's in some other ones. So the lobotomies work. They do. But it takes away the other part of us that we don't want to lose, right? That part of us that, for me, that keeps me here. Without that part of my brain of experience, of being able to experience pleasure, I'm not here anymore, right? And by pleasure, that has changed. My idea of pleasure is much different, right? Like, for example, I actually got a great deal of pleasure out of being away in the mountains, even though one of the days was spent beating the shit out of myself. I still was able to take from that experience something that was more probably healthy and something that I can absolutely incorporate into my new daily life with treating my depression and my addiction. So let's take a look here. Okay, we got through some of the options for treatment. Now, making peace with what is going on inside our brain. This is going to be the battle for us. This is what I see as my battle anyway. You can determine what's yours. For me, that's the battle, is being okay with it. Being able to have conversations like this, put them out there, and by conversations, obviously, I mean monologue. Kind of conversational, but I think part of it for me to become okay with it is to help other people who know me, but even people who don't, know that I struggle with this, and at the same time that I'm struggling with this, I'm still able to work, okay? I'm still able to have a family. I have a partner, and our cats are our family, but that's our family, right? I'm able to work in a lot, right? And work in a field where I'm faced with myself quite often, right? Where I'm working with people who are experiencing things that I have either experienced or am experiencing. And the idea is then we start working together. It's not just me working with them. They're working with me too. And that's really what the relationship is all about for me, is the give and take that we give each other in terms of simply helping us survive long enough to then thrive, right? Survive to thrive, right? And if we go back to the harm reduction video, that's basically what we're talking about, okay? Survive so that we can thrive. Now, we did a brief overview of this. I did not touch on every symptom, but I know if you're out there still listening, you have your own. And you have your own list of things that happen when your mental illness takes over, whatever that illness is. And so I'm going to encourage us all, myself included, that in between time, that we really get serious about how we treat ourselves, right? With kindness and compassion and love. And that means we're going to do things in between times, in between symptoms or episodes, that are life-affirming for us, as best we can, right? We're going to make mistakes. We're going to be imperfect. This isn't a perfect process, and it's not intended to build perfect people. What it's intended to do is help us become the broken, useful, wonderful human that we are, whatever that looks like, right? So anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. We really appreciate you, all of the viewers, subscribers, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please take a minute to subscribe to the channel if you want more videos, and if you don't, then don't subscribe.